Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. We're continuing our series on the Exodus. Did it happen? What evidence do we have for it? And what can we know about the other events surrounding it? We're really excited about this series, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of these videos. For today's video, we're going to start with the event that kicked off the Exodus, the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues are recorded in the book of Exodus in chapters 7 through 12. The plagues are described as signs and wonders God performs so that he will get glory over Pharaoh. The text says that the God of the Israelites sent these plagues on Egypt in order to convince the Pharaoh to release the Israelites from slavery. Scholars have long recognized multiple traditions within the text, but also that it is so well woven together that it essentially exists as one sophisticated literary unit. Scholars have identified different patterns and literary links between the plagues, but for our purposes, we'll just look at what the 10 plagues are. They are, first, the Nile being turned to blood. Second, the plague of frogs. Third, the plague of insects, maybe gnats, lice, or mosquitoes. Fourth, the plague of flies. The fifth plague is a kind of pestilence that affected livestock. The sixth is some kind of skin malady like boils. Seventh is hail, thunder, and lightning. Eighth is the plague of locusts. Ninth is darkness over the land. And the final plague was the death of the firstborn, except for those households who had put the blood of a lamb on their doorpost. Now, you're probably familiar with these plagues, or you've at least heard of them as a group, but you may not have explored how plausible it is for them to have actually happened. So, did the plagues in Egypt actually happen? That's what we're going to look at now.
We don't know for certain if these 10 plagues are historical events. There are no references to these plagues in sources outside of the Bible, and they're not the kind of things that would have left any material remnants for archaeologists to discover. The Egyptians did not record them, at least not in relation to the Israelites. But this isn't surprising. The Egyptians kept good records, but we only have a fraction of what once existed, so a lot of what we do have is an accident of preservation. This is true even for well-sourced periods where we have a lot of records. Also, the Egyptians tended not to record their losses. They would even spin their losses into victories. For example, the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites seems to have been a stalemate, if not an outright Hittite victory. But Ramses the Great records it as his own victory. Given this tendency, a series of supernatural plagues striking the land and attributed to a foreign god would probably not have been recorded. We should also note that there are a lot of things that happen in history that are either unrecorded or only attested by one or two sources, but are still generally considered historical. The supernatural nature of these plagues make many suspect their historicity, but for many people of faith, this really isn't a problem. So, if you believe these are a fully supernatural sequence of events that God miraculously orchestrated through Moses and Aaron, as recorded in the Bible, that is an article of faith you can certainly hold to. There are other interpretations, however, that see these as natural events with miraculous timing, rather than as completely supernatural events. A lot of theories about this natural and supernatural relationship have been proposed, but we think Greta Hort has perhaps the best one. She sees the 10 plagues as a consequence of an overly flooded Nile, with each plague occurring as a consequence of the previous one. To understand the significance of this sequence of events, we need to understand the importance of the Nile for life in Egypt. The Nile flooded every year, and this cycle is essential to the survival of Egypt. When it rains down in Africa, the waters flow into the Nile and ultimately out into the Mediterranean. As those floodwaters come down the Nile, they pick up soil and nutrients from Central Africa, and as the river floods in Egypt, it deposits that new soil and consequently makes Egypt an incredibly fertile land. You can see here the limits of the floodplain, where the soil is seasonally deposited and thus fertile, versus the arid desert. This was a yearly flood, and the Egyptians even had a god for the inundation of the Nile, named Hapi. So, how could these 10 plagues have been the result of a natural sequence of events with divine timing? Let's start with the first plague. Greta Hort has suggested that the Nile overflooding, which occurs in August and September, changes the color of the water off into a red color. The Ipuwer papyrus from around the 12th dynasty discusses the river being as blood. So this was a phenomenon with precedent in Egypt. Hort suggests that this overflooded Nile, which appeared red, had an abundance of cellular life called flagellates, which likely came into the Nile via flooded lakes in Ethiopia. The abundance of flagellates could kill fish in the river because of how they altered the oxygen content of the water. Next is the plague of frogs. Frogs often leave the Nile during the annual inundation, and they would have left in abundance to escape the poor water conditions caused by flagellate bloom and decomposing fish. Hort further suggests that the decomposing fish contaminated the frogs with the bacterium Bacillus anthracus, a naturally occurring bacterium in the region. You probably know this bacterium as anthrax. This naturally occurring anthrax is still prevalent in low levels in soil, so much so that amongst archaeologists it's said that those of us who work with our hands in the dirt are said to develop immunity as we're slowly exposed to it over time. Next, the plague of insects. The overflooded Nile would have left pools which were ideal for mosquito propagation. This is how many people translate the insect in the third plague. The fourth plague was likely what are called dog flies, which are infamous for their bite. They would have feasted on the decomposing frogs, and the fifth plague of pestilence may be a contamination of the Bacillus anthracus, or anthrax, which the frogs brought onto land. The flies may have passed the anthrax to humans, resulting in a widespread infection, which is the sixth plague. So we see how these first 6 plagues may have resulted from a sequence of events, all related to the annual inundation of the Nile. The last 4 plagues are not connected to the inundation of the Nile, according to Hort. Violent storms do strike Egypt from time to time, though hail is incredibly rare. This would have been a source of fear and surprise to the people of Egypt. Locust plagues are common in this part of the world and are attested in other documents from the ancient world. Most locust plagues originated in Sudan and blew into the Near East from there. They came from the southeast, which fits the east wind referenced in Exodus 10:13. The 3 days of darkness have been associated with a kind of dust storm called a hamsin. While many of us may be skeptical that a dust storm could cause the kind of darkness described, those who have experienced these kinds of storms attest to the darkness that they do bring. The description in 10:21 that the darkness can be felt may be a reference to the dust in the air that blocks out the sun. The final plague, the death of the firstborn, is pretty much universally recognized as a supernatural phenomenon, the historicity of which must either be accepted or rejected as a matter of faith. Now, if Hort is right, which I tend to think she is, this does not discount the miraculous nature of these events. As we will see with much of the Exodus narrative, the miraculous element is not necessarily in the events themselves, but in their timing. These events can be seen as God miraculously taking over what we would call natural phenomena to accomplish his goals. But we should also remember that the distinction between natural and supernatural phenomena is our own modern dichotomy, one that would be utterly rejected in the ancient world. Natural phenomena had supernatural correlates. So while we may have naturalistic explanations of the plagues, they would certainly have been understood as in a supernatural way. This is certainly how the magicians of Egypt understood it after they failed to replicate the third plague. This brings up a further point of interpretation. While we have looked at these plagues as historical phenomena, we should also consider their function in the Exodus narrative.
So while the 10 plagues make an interesting case study when it comes to interpreting them historically, there's also a rhetorical element to them that we shouldn't overlook. The plagues have been reasonably interpreted as polemics against Egypt, Egypt's gods, and the Pharaoh. Particular effort has been made to find specific Egyptian gods that the plagues were meant to target. The Nile turning to blood has been seen as targeting Hapi, who is often erroneously called the god of the Nile. Alternatively, it could target Osiris, whose annual resurrection was associated with the annual inundation of the Nile. The darkening of the sun may be an affront to Ra or Atum, the sun gods. The frogs have been seen as targeting Hecate, a goddess often shown with a frog head. The pestilence targeting livestock is sometimes said to target Hathor, who often has a cow's appearance, or the Apis bull, a sacred bull that was kept in Memphis and whose remains were mummified at the site of Saqqara. However, just because these gods had these features doesn't mean the Egyptians associated the creatures with the gods. All cows were not sacred just because Hathor had a cow appearance. There was only one Apis bull at a time, Not all bulls were Apis bulls or potentially sacred. Hecate had a frog appearance, but this afforded no special status to frogs. Plus, when the Bible engages in a polemic against other gods, it usually isn't shy about calling them out, usually by name. Baal and Asherah in particular come to mind as they are repeatedly named later in the Old Testament. So, instead of targeting specific Egyptian gods, we may look at who these plagues seem to target in the text itself: Pharaoh. This is the perspective of the Egyptologist James Hoffmeier, and we follow his lead here. In this case, we think the plagues are best understood as a direct assault on the authority of Pharaoh. Specifically, they target the Pharaoh's ability to maintain the cosmic order that ancient Egyptians called Ma'at. Ma'at was both the daughter of the sun god and the embodiment of right rule and justice. She was the symbol of the cosmic order established at creation. Preserving Ma'at was one of the Pharaoh's chief duties. The absence of Ma'at was called Isfet, chaos or disorder. When there is Isfet in the land, things are bleak. The Ipuwer Papyrus that we mentioned earlier talks about the Nile being like blood as a sign of Isfet being in the land. Also from that papyrus is the prophecy of Neferti, which tells about how Ma'at can be restored by right rule by a good king. You can tell Ma'at is gone when the natural world reflects it. The natural world reflects the state of the supernatural world. The plagues then can be seen as a direct assault on Pharaoh being unable to preserve Ma'at. The entire natural world, the lifeblood of Egypt, is out of balance, a clear sign that there is Isfet, and clearly the fault of Pharaoh in Egyptian political philosophy. We've discussed Ma'at in another video, which you can see here if you want to learn more. One final point that hammers home the plagues as an affront to Pharaoh's authority and kingship is the transformation of Aaron's staff in Exodus 7, just before the plagues begin. From early times in Egypt, the Pharaoh was shown holding a shepherd's crook, or a rod. The crook and flail were originally associated with the god Osiris, but they came to be the signs of Pharaoh's authority. You can see them here and here. The Pharaoh is holding a flail in one hand and the shepherd's crook in the other. Egyptian texts talk about people being the flock of the gods, and it follows that the Pharaoh was their shepherd who cared for them on behalf of the gods. When Moses and Aaron appear in Pharaoh's court, they turn Aaron's own shepherd's staff into a serpent, a symbol associated with the well-being of the Pharaoh in the Uraeus symbol. Aaron's serpent devours those of the Egyptian magicians, then it turns back into a staff. This should be seen as a clear threat and symbolic message to Pharaoh using the symbols of his own office. After this episode of the transforming staff, the plagues begin with the Nile turning to blood. We think putting the story of the plagues in their geographical and historical contexts helps us better interpret these chapters in Exodus. The 10 plagues are an incredible story, and they really kick off the Exodus story, which is itself a foundational story in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The Exodus is the reference point for Israel's identity as a people, and we see its importance throughout the Old Testament. As modern readers, we can recognize that a distinction between the natural and the supernatural is a bias we bring to the text, and that even as natural phenomena with perhaps miraculous timing, the plagues are fulfilling a divine purpose. The plagues end with the killing of the firstborn and the celebration of the first Passover, a feast still celebrated by millions today. It's a celebration that Jesus himself participated in, and which he reinterpreted as a sign for his followers to remember his death and resurrection. Christians today still commemorate these events when we celebrate the Lord's Supper. For Christians, the foreshadowing of the 10th plague is the most important result of these 10 plagues. It anticipated when the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world, would be sacrificed for all people, so that death would pass by those who are marked by his blood. In Jesus, the events that the Exodus was looking forward to were finally fulfilled. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we've included some references and resources in the description below. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter @Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.